Now in this lesson, let's see how a basic line of CSS looks like so that we can actually start typing and writing our CSS. We will write our first line of CSS code in this lesson. So let's get started. For example, I have a heading that says this heading has a class pink subtitle, and this heading will actually have a CSS class called pink subtitle. And now let's see how we could actually style this class and give it some values in CSS. So this is how this CSS code for the pink subtitle class could look like. Now let's go further and analyze it line by line, word by word. First of all, you can see that we are calling out a class with a dot. If you remember, we said that a class is called out with a dot and ID is called out with a hashtag. Since we are using a class pink subtitle, we are using a dot. Then we are typing the class name. In our case, it is pink subtitle, and remember, it cannot have any spaces. And then we are using the selector. We are defining the element that we are styling. In my case, I'm using a heading, and more specifically, a heading of level 2, which means that I can just simply type H2. And after this, we are opening the curly bracket. Now, the curly bracket starts basically your CSS code itself. And how one line of CSS code looks like. Well, basically, we are defining a property, then we put a colon, and then after this, we are defining the value for that property and use semicolon to close that line. And then afterwards, we can add more lines as necessary for each property. For example, I'm using on this line a property font weight. And then I'm using a colon to define the value for that property. The value for my font weight property in my case is 700, which means usually a little bit bolder text. If I was to use something like 400 or 300, it would be regular or light text, regular or light font. And after this, I'm using a semicolon to close my line of CSS code. Once I define all my properties and all my values, and we will be talking about these just in a little bit, because they are different for text, they are different for images, and we will go through all of these font family, font weights, font sizes, and so on, colors in one of the following lessons. But once we are done defining all these properties and giving all the values, we close that class styling with another curly bracket. And then we can move on to the next class. And then again, we would use the same pattern. So a dot, class name, selector, opening the bracket, and then defining all these properties and values. These are just some samples to make you realize how actually intuitive CSS is. This is actually a line of CSS code that you can use to style your text. For example, property font size, which determines exactly as you might think font size, and the value of 20 pixels. So we have the property font size, colon, we have the value of 20 pixels, and remember to define the units, in our case pixels, and then we close that line of code with a semicolon. We can use, for example, width property and define it as 300 pixels, use semicolon to close that line, border radius to define the curvy edges, let's say, or these kind of rounded corners of buttons and so on. We can use a background color and use hex values, RGB values, and so on. So you can see that these are very intuitive and easy to understand what they represent. But basically, they're all following the same principle. A property, colon, value, and semicolon. And that is one line of CSS code. Margin top, for example, and so on. Now let's actually get into the coding and let's start writing our first line of CSS code. Before we continue, this video is a part of our online course, CSS Basics, focusing on practice and aimed specifically at beginners without any coding experience and designers. In this course, you will learn the basics of CSS without tech talk through simple language, visual explanations, and short lessons, and a series of interactive, hands-on custom exercises, not just the theory. If you would like to learn more and get access to the full course and the exercises, check the link in the description or just continue watching these videos for free. Now let's get back to the video. I will show you how easy it is to use CSS. I will just show you two simple CSS lines, and don't worry, we will discuss all the CSS so that you can actually start writing it in the next lesson. This is not about specific CSS code rules. It is just to kind of show you how the exercises would look like and what we just talked about in the video. So we have some HTML here. And as I said, the first thing you want to do when you're doing the exercises and in general is to understand how HTML is built. So we will just read it quickly. So you can see that we have some div here, and this div has a class called myText. Inside this div, you can see that we have some h3, which means heading of the level 3. We have some paragraph, and you can also see that whenever we have an element or a div, we have some opening tags, and then we have some closing tags. And those closing tags, they start with this slash. And then we have paragraph, which means P, as if you remember. Then we have some content here, and then we close. We have these closing tags for our paragraph that again start with a slash. And then we also have the closing tags for our div. So this is our box or our container that contains the heading and the paragraph. And this container has the class myText. All right, now we are done with analyzing our HTML, so we can start writing some CSS. I will just go into my CSS field here, and you don't have to touch the HTML. You can if you want, but you don't have to. It is basically pre-made for you. So the only thing you need to worry about is the CSS field. Now let's start with typing. So I want to adjust and to style my class, which is called myText. So if you remember in the previous video, we said that we need to call the class with the dot. So I will type dot, and then my class, which is myText, and I'm opening the curly brackets. And don't forget to also close them, because all the code that you're writing will be inside this opening and closing curly brackets. And let's say that I want to change the font of my elements within this class or within this container to something else. In my case, I won't use the selector like P or H3. I won't target these individual elements because I'm targeting the whole class and everything that's contained in it. So I will just leave this as it is, and I will type font family, which is the property of the text, which we will talk about in the next lesson. And I will type colon, and then I will type the value for that property. In my case, I will type apostrophe, and I will write Roboto, because that is the font that I want to use for my class. Then a comma and sans serif, because this is usually how you define the font family. Again, don't worry, you will learn about this in the next lesson. And once I'm done with styling this particular property or this line of CSS, I want to close that line with a semicolon. So this is basically what we were talking in the video before, and now you can see it in action, and you can see that all these changes that I'm applying, they're applying directly in this result tab, and you can see them as you are typing. Now let's also say that I want to change this heading to red color and maybe a little bit bigger. So I will just type another line, I will hit enter, and I want to define, in this case, I want to actually go back to my class, so I will type dot myText, but this time I'm targeting h3 element of my class, which means that I need a selector h3, and this will apply this styling and these changes only to my heading. This is heading. So now I can type again. I'm using the curly brackets, don't forget those, and don't forget to close them. And then I will define my property. In my case, the property that we use for font color is simply color. Then I use a colon. I will use the value, and in my case, I will just type red. I do not need to necessarily use the hex or RGB values and so on. I can use just simply words like red, green, blue for these basic colors. And then I will close that line with a semicolon. And now let's say that I want to also change the font size. So I will just hit simply enter for a new line. And then I will change font size property, which is a predefined property for the font size. I will type colon, and then my value, in my case, let's say something like 36 pixels. And I will type a semicolon to close that line. And there you go. This is how easy it is to apply CSS to the HTML. And this is exactly how your exercises would look like. So we are basically just calling out classes and defining different properties and values, and you can see this directly in the result window, whatever you are typing.